I do a slideshow about the history of Classics Illustrated and their followers, and I'll explain what that is all about. What Bill and I have talked about together and in our various classes and lectures kind of dovetail. So I'm going to take over for this section and show you a little bit of the stuff that I was kind of reacting against. So I guess I'm a parody of some of this. Although this strip from Mad, If Authors Wrote the Comics, was done in about 1963, I believe. It's drawn by Wally Wood, and is very close to what I'm doing. He has, if Patty Chayefsky wrote Donald Duck, if Kipling wrote Peanuts, if Walt Whitman wrote The Katzenjammer Kids, and my favorite at the very bottom, if Edgar Allan Poe wrote Dennis the Menace, where he's crying his house to the ground. And this is obviously virtually the same idea of what I'm doing. But you'll see as we talk more about how I put my strips together and how they, and we'll talk a little bit about how they might do the same thing. There is a lot of editorializing in Mad, and I really try to leave that out in my own work. There's always the kind of the Mad voice that permeates the stories that they do. And for the most part, I've tried to shun that out and really just focus on being faithful to both my sources, no matter how poorly they match up. That's kind of the joke, ultimately. In any case, I'm going to flip back to the beginning of the 20th century again to sort of show you some of the precedents which probably inspired this Mad story. In the early days of newspaper comics, there were a lot of different genres, and there was a strip by an artist named Ed Whelan called Minute Movies, and he hit upon the idea of adapting the classics, actually parodying them. First of all, they got more serious as he went along, but originally they were straight up parodies. And here is his version of Don Quixote, which features a prohibition agent who tilts at gin mills, mistaking windmills for gin mills, and hilarity ensues. And I think one of the reasons so many cartoonists have been drawn toward working with the classics, beyond these like great stories that are pre-made for us, is also, for the most part, they're copyright free. And that comes up a lot in these adaptations. This is actually a crazy thing. You probably wouldn't recognize that this is Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, but this is actually from a comic strip of the same name by an artist named Dwig, who got the rights from Mark Twain and then proceeded to just invent stories that had nothing to do with the books. They go on adventures, they go on safaris, they meet mermaids, they meet jungle queens, they meet everybody except the characters in the book. These are all from around the 30s and 40s, what I'm showing you right now. This is a wonderful strip by the artist Milt Gross, who I think we can clearly say was an inspiration for Harvey Kurtzman, so thus an inspiration for me. This is his version of Rebecca. He's actually, talk about meta, he's reviewing the movie Rebecca that's based on the novel, and he's retelling it in 30 silent panels. He does a pretty good job of getting all the good points in. And it has this crazy, goofy, screwball style, but it's a fairly faithful version of the storyline, which I kind of find pretty amusing. He did a series of these that have never really been collected. And then from the newspapers sprung the comic books, and a lot of the early comic books would reprint the newspaper strips, but then they would need filler pages. And again, what's better way to get filler than to get anonymous artists to draw versions of the classics? So here's just a few of those. This is a version of Ivanhoe. And
so these are just like fillers that ran in comic books just
yeah,
to sort of occupy space?
I think so. I think so. What cracks me up about this is it essentially looks like Prince Valiant, but they probably couldn't afford Prince Valiant, so they got Ivanhoe instead. This is a version of The Tale of Two Cities. And what I love about this one, this is probably 1939, what I love about this one is they're already moving away from comics. You'll see at the top they call it an illustrated narrative. And they're trying to class up the joint a little bit by doing Tale of Two Cities, not using word balloons, that would be too crass, I guess, so it's all done in captions. And then Picture Stories from the Bible came out in the 40s, long before Robert Crumb was a gleam in his father's eye. I just wanted to show you this because this is what you really call an early graphic novel. It was a 240-page adaptation of the Old Testament, and they also did the New Testament.
But not published as a book, of course, right? Just as like 40-page comic books.
Yes, although I think the issues were collected as a fat comic book. Maybe not 240 pages. I don't know if they could do that. But yes, they were originally published as serial comic books. And I just want to show you the creation story, because if you've seen Crumb's version, this is a somewhat different take. Besides the strategic placement of shrubbery in front of all the naughty bits, there's also the family resemblance to Clark Kent and Lois Lane in terms of the drawing style. This was actually published by DC just around the same time that Superman came around, and they're certainly like kind of working in the house style of those comic books. I won't show you all 240 pages, but it's an interesting example of someone like really grappling with this and trying to do it right, trying to do it justice, but clearly it is a comic book. You know, it's not literature, but he kept these things in print. He reprinted them, and he, like I said, this was Max Gaines was the editor-in-chief at this point, and he was really trying to bring intelligence and great literature to the kiddies. He actually died tragically, and his son took over the company. And while Max Gaines he had an offshoot from DC, his own company called Educational Comics. When his son took over the company, he changed the name to Entertaining Comics and gave us Tales from the Crypt. So, if you may remember in the earlier cover, we had little circles of Joseph and Moses and other heroes. Now we have the Crypt Keeper, the Vault Keeper, and the Old Witch sort of taking their places. And as grotesque as these comics were, and hugely popular, they also made a point of adapting more stories. They would take stories from Ray Bradbury, first without his knowledge, and then he liked them so much he let them keep going. And they did these very earnest, despite these lurid covers, they did these very earnest and thoughtful and beautifully drawn adaptations of, in this case, a Ray Bradbury story. And there's a lot of nuance in the drawing. The artist is Bernie Krigstein, who mainly worked in comics in the 50s, really wanted to bring fine art to comics, and nobody would let him then. There weren't graphic novels yet. So he would pour his heart and soul into stories like this that take place in early China, and you'll see he's trying to get the style of Chinese landscape paintings. It's very thought through. It's very intelligently done, so they were trying really hard to find to bring literature into comics and to make these stories worth reading for adults. A lot of the audiences were adults at that point.
And going back to what you were pointing out before, how the adaptation of Tale of Two Cities was called an illustrated narrative, there really was a sense, I think, that by either adapting work by these authors, they were really sort of classing up the joint, you know, that they were trying to reach an older readership and make some kind of claim for legitimacy, I think.
Yes, and also sort of, I think, remove the stigma that comics already had. The first comic, The Yellow Kid, was instantly a sensation, and it horrified so many people. It was these kids in the slums of New York beating each other up, gambling, doing all sorts of things. It was essentially South Park, but it was in newspapers every day, and it hadn't been seen before, and librarians and teachers and parents were pulling their hair out over this stuff. So while EC wasn't trying to, they just wanted to have fun, they wanted to make fun stories, but while they weren't trying to class up the joint, there were a number of publishers who, it's a combination of meaning well, and also, I think, yeah, trying to give it a little bit more legitimacy. Out of EC Comics came Mad, which brings us full circle.